Hello everyone, Kibler here, and today I wanted to talk about a topic that has been pretty hot in the Hearthstone community, the state of Hearthstone competitive play. This is a topic with a lot of different facets to it, but I want to start with the elephant in the room, or perhaps more appropriately, the old god in the room, Yogg-Saron, and more broadly, the role of randomness in Hearthstone and specifically competitive Hearthstone. So, I'm someone who loves Yogg-Saron. I'm someone who, when I'm playing on ladder, tries to make decks that do really big and dramatic and cool and sometimes random things, and I have a ton of fun doing it. But I understand that there are a lot of people who look at the competitive scene in Hearthstone and see what Yogg-Saron can do in some games, and they're like, whoa, hold on, this is not something we feel is okay. And I recognize that, I can see that. But one thing that I think that a lot of people sort of lose sight of is that Yogg-Saron is a 10-mana card, and 10-mana cards really ought to be pretty powerful when they have an effect on a game. If we look at the results of the America's Summer Championship, we saw Yogg-Saron played a bunch of times, and Disguised Toast actually did a video highlighting all of the Yogg-Sarons that were played, and if you actually look at a lot of them, there were a few that were pretty powerful, and there were quite a few of them that actually just didn't do anything, and the player who played Yogg-Saron lost the game. And there's some that were actively negative for their player. And when you look at the response that people had to a lot of these games and to a lot of these Yogg-Sarons, it was overwhelmingly negative on social media. You'd see every single time Yogg is played in a competitive match, you see posts on Reddit, you see tweets that people are like, oh my god, Yogg-Saron deciding a game. And there were people who were posting after the finals that they were saying, congratulations to the winner, but I wish Yogg hadn't decided the game. And these are actually games where, like, the player who's ahead stayed ahead after, like, both players played Yogg-Saron. Or, any game in which Yogg-Saron is played is sort of viewed as a game that Yogg-Saron decided in some capacity, even if the player who was winning kept winning, or even if the player who played Yogg-Saron didn't even have that big of an effect from it. And I think that's in itself kind of a problem. One thing that's we could look at, which I don't have access to, but Blizzard could look at, and I don't think that this is really necessarily in their interest to do, is actually compare the win rate when played of, like, Yogg-Saron versus other high-cost cards like N'Zoth or Cthulhu or even Tyrion Fordring. So if we look at the number of times where someone played Yogg-Saron and they would have won if they had just played Deathwing instead, or if we look at the number of times they played Yogg-Saron and they lost, but they would have won if they just played Deathwing instead, we're really comparing this to sort of more what the role of Yogg-Saron is in a lot of these decks, which is largely this catch-up mechanic, this ability to come back in a game when you're largely behind. But Yogg-Saron is one that makes that happen in a way that's unsatisfying to a lot of players. And one thing that's really important to keep in mind in game design in general is that a lot of people think of it as sort of building a sort of mathematical system. They're like, oh, this is balanced, this is imbalanced, this is whatever, you just look at numbers. But ultimately, what you're creating is an experience for people. What you're creating is something that people feel something about. And when so many people have these experiences involving a card like Yogg-Saron, which are so powerfully negative, not just when playing it, but when watching it, I think that's a problem. Because we've seen the sort of community reaction to Yogg-Saron, and the fact that so many people, like, make jokes about it, or so many people even legitimately feel like it's somehow undermining the competitive integrity of the game, that's a problem in itself. I think that, like, if we looked at the win rates, say, of high-level players, like some of the top players in tournament play, I don't know that they're necessarily very different in a world where Yogg-Saron exists and a world where Yogg-Saron doesn't exist. I mean, if you look at the recent championship, the most recent championship, the Europe Summer Championship, we actually saw the two returning players, who were two of course, the favorites going to the event, meet in the finals. And if the game was decided wholly by randomness, like some people want you to believe, that certainly wouldn't be something we see happening. We wouldn't see these returning players not only making it back to the championship, but meeting in the finals. And the reality is that Hearthstone is very much a game that rewards skill. But the problem is that cards like Yogg-Saron, the community reaction to the card of Yogg-Saron, kind of undermines that. And we even see this with the players bringing it upon themselves in a way. We see players downplaying their own hard work and their own training and their own success. We had a player at the Americas Championship in the summer season who wouldn't talk in his interviews about how hard he prepared and how much he played and how much time he spent preparing his lineup and researching and working with his practice partners and such. And we saw George C. get on stage, and when Ferdinand asked him, how did you make it back here? And he was like, I don't know, I guess I played Yogg. Literally the night before, I'd had a conversation with George C. at dinner where he told me about like a 2.5-hour conversation he had with one of his practice partners about a single turn of Hearthstone. And when sort of the attitude of the community surrounding competitive Hearthstone has just become so toxic, really, in terms of players not even wanting to recognize their own work that goes into being successful in the game competitively, because there's such this attitude of negativity surrounding, and just getting mocked for saying, I'm great at the game, I try hard. And some of it is brought upon themselves. Some of it is a matter of the players, sort of undermining their own success by complaining about luck every time that they lose. And some of it is a matter of just the public perception being this sort of toxic thing that is rooted in this perception of a very small number of cards. And randomness is a funny thing in games, because randomness, I think, is very important to Hearthstone. Not only do I think that randomness is something that is particularly crucial to Hearthstone because of the way the game engine works. There's actually a lot of elements of the game engine in Hearthstone that are very low variance. The game engine, given the fact that you get a resource every single turn, you have a hero power that you can use every turn, and you have a mulligan system that actually significantly allows you to have very similar hands every game, and the player whose turn it is directs how combat works. All of that leads to actually a fairly low variance game in the world of card games. And that all sort of adds up to, in order for Hearthstone to have a satisfying replayability and game experience for the vast majority of players, it needs randomness. It needs more randomness than just drawing cards from a deck really allows. But there are different types of randomness that are better and worse for players. And in some ways, randomness that has an enormous delta, for instance, a card that can have a very positive effect or a very negative effect, or its best result and its worst result have a big gap between them, those can be really frustrating because they cause one player to be mad in any situation. One example of that is Tuskar Totemic, alongside Yogg-Saron. And Tuskar Totemic is a card that is frustrating because when you get Totem Golem, it's super powerful. When you get Searing Totem, it's pretty mediocre. And that's going to cause someone involved in playing Tuskar Totemic to kind of feel bad whenever that card gets played. And Tuskar Totemic is a card that actually has been around for so long, but the problem is that it happens all the time. And this is another issue with randomness, is that random elements that happen frequently and have a big effect are things that can be very frustrating for players. And that's one of the things with Tuskar Totemic. This is something that happens all the time, and it didn't happen quite as much before Shaman was a powerful class. The fact that Shaman is the most popular class on ladder right now contributes a great deal to the frustration that people have when they play against Tuskar Totemic, because it's something that you see happen to you pretty much every single game or every other game. I've had a number of experiences where I played against 4 straight Shaman in a row, and they all got some special totem from Tuskar Totemic. And I'm generally a very even-keeled individual. People don't see me raging on my stream on a regular basis, but even those sort of situations, I'm just like, oh my god, just stop, okay? So that's one of the elements of randomness, which is very different than a lot of the other randomness in Hearthstone that I think is fine. Like Animal Companion, for instance, is a card that has actually kind of been deciding games of Hearthstone since the dawn of time, or Brawl, or Sylvanas. These are all types of randomness, but these are, in some cases, like Brawl or Sylvanas, these are manageable randomness. And in the case of Animal Companion, this is a case of randomness where the delta between the results is not that big. Of course, in a particular situation, you might be like, oh my god, I really want Huffer, oh my god, I really want Misha. But in aggregate, there's not a huge gap like there is with Tuskar Totemic or like there is with Yogg-Saron. So a lot of this ultimately becomes a perception issue. And that's ultimately what I think the problem is with randomness in Hearthstone. I don't think that Yogg is causing enormous changes in players' win rates or causing players to be successful or unsuccessful in tournament play, for whom it is deserved or not. And but the problem is that people think that's happening. People think that Yogg is deciding all of these important titles. They think that Yogg is the end-all, be-all, and it falls into all those sort of categories. It's something that's happening all the time because Druid is a very popular class, and that's kind of another issue with just how powerful Druid's core cards are from the Classic set, despite all the nerfs that happened. That's something I'm going to revisit maybe a little bit later in this, and certainly in future videos. But similarly with Shaman's the Tuskar dynamics are happening all the time because Shaman is one of the most popular classes. So these are combining to have, happening all the time, huge delta, and feel like they're determining games. The big thing with Yogg-Saron is that because Yogg-Saron is something that happens generally at the end of a game and has this dramatic and very high delta in terms of power level random effect, it has this enormous impact in terms of the emotional response that people have to it. And you play Yogg-Saron, or your opponent plays Yogg-Saron, and something dramatic happens, because that's basically always what happens when playing Yogg-Saron, you feel differently than I rolled a Huffer turn 3, or I rolled a Misha turn 3. And the randomness that ends the game is much more memorable than the randomness that just kind of happens somewhere in the middle. So I think that in the interest of, not necessarily competitive integrity, but in the interest of the perception of competitive integrity, I'd love to see Blizzard do something about Yogg-Saron in competitive play. And whether that's something is removing it from competitive play, like saying Yogg-Saron is not allowed to be played in HCT or similar sorts of events, or whether it's doing something to change the card that causes it to not be something people want to put into their high-level competitive decks. Either of those I'm okay with. I really hope that if Yogg-Saron does get changed, that it doesn't get changed to something that makes me not want to play it and do crazy things when I'm just building decks for fun, because that's one of the really important things to keep in mind. The percentage of players who actually play Hearthstone and care significantly about competitive play and are super invested and feel like the best player winning is the most important thing in the world represent a very small fraction of the people who play Hearthstone as a whole. I would be shocked if more people want Yogg-Saron to be changed than don't, because it's a card that's super fun for a lot of players who, don't have this massive investment in what is this perception of competitive integrity. And on top of that, that's issue number one. So that's my randomness in Hearthstone treatise or whatever. Going on from there, issues in competitive Hearthstone that I think are important. Competitive balance. This is another one that has come up a lot. People talking about how they feel the development of Hearthstone is flawed, or that they feel like, they really want Blizzard to change cards on a regular basis. And I want to talk about both my thoughts on the current state of balance, as well as factors that contribute to competitive balance, and the general thoughts on balance changes. So let's start with the last one of those. General thoughts on balance changes. I think that generally speaking, in a game like Hearthstone, frequently changing cards is bad. And there's several reasons for this. People talk about games like World of Warcraft or League of Legends or similar games like that when they talk about this company patches their game all the time and they make constant changes, and that's great because it does all these various things. The difference between changing a card in Hearthstone and changing the stats of a thing in World of Warcraft or the damage of a spell in League of Legends, there's a huge gap there in terms of the player experience. Because in Hearthstone, in a card game, when you change something, it's a discrete change. You can see that this thing changed. This changed from costing 2 to 3, or this changed from doing 5 damage to 8 damage. When you do something like that, like the mana cost of a spell in WoW or the damage of an ability in League of Legends, when those change, those are invisible. Those aren't things that appreciably change my experience other than how powerful my character is, and only the absolute most invested players will ever notice that difference. In a card game, that change is something that everyone has to know. Not only do they, have to actually play the card and see, oh, well, this does something different than I want it to do, but if they're going to, build a deck, they have to feel like they understand all the cards that have changed and might change. And that really kind of drives a lot of people away from games. I've seen games where they've had frequent changes in a collectible card game, and those are games that often can struggle because players may play the game for a while, come back, find out that they had a deck that was built around this card that changed completely, and they're like, oh, well, this sucks. I don't want to play this anymore. This is the deck that I like to play. I'm done. And we've kind of seen something like this in Hearthstone. The wild format is like kind of a wasteland. And the reason for that, in my mind, a big part of the reason for that is because of the nerfs. Because of the fact that Blizzard chose to make dramatic changes to cards like Molten Giant and Force of Nature, Leper Gnome, and the fact that this is not a format that feels like old Hearthstone. The idea, in my mind, of having a format where you can play every card through Hearthstone's history is that you can play your old decks. Your old deck might be gone from Standard, but now you can play it in Wild, despite the fact that those cards that you wanted to play with are now gone. The policy of nerfing cards, rather than removing them from Standard in some other way, means that that's just not possible. Means that you can't play your Handlock deck. You can never play your Handlock deck, really, because Molten Giant is now just a bad card, and you could build a bad Handlock deck, but you can't have the same experience you had when you were playing Handlock before. And I talked a lot about this right when the Standard rotation policy was announced, and I have hope that once Blizzard eased people into the idea of Standard and the idea of rotation, that they may take a bigger step and have a rotating core set rather than the classic set as we know it now. But just that the fact that we've seen exactly this sort of thing happen with cards being changed leads to people kind of not really being interested in playing decks that they used to play, even when the environment exists for them to play them. So I'm really hesitant about balance changes, especially on any sort of regular basis. I think the one big yearly change that it looks like might be the policy with respect to Standard and the Classic set is at most what I'd really like to see. That, obviously, if there are cards that are dramatically out of line, and there's the need to shake things up, maybe there is right now, because there are, seeing Warrior, Druid, Shaman in every single lineup is kind of dispiriting. But part of that isn't just a balance issue. Part of that is a tournament format issue. And I do think Shaman in particular is kind of out of line. Like, it's almost impossible to build a deck that's like, I'm going to crush Shaman. And it's like, oh, well, what can you possibly do to target them? Everything they can do is so good right now. But I think that part of the lack of diversity we're seeing is based on tournament formats. And people say, oh, Conquest versus Last Year Standing. I don't think that either of those is necessarily what I'm talking about. I think specifically in the championships, we are seeing best of 7 Conquest. And one of the problems with best of 7 Conquest is that because players need to bring 5 different decks and win with 4 of them after the ban, it's more difficult to create a coherent strategy which does something in particular. Like we actually saw with best of 5 Conquest, like for instance last year's BlizzCon, last year's World Championship. We saw a number of players, including eventual World Champion Osaka, as well as semi-finalist Tice, who had decks in their lineups. They had a specific plan, and like, okay, I'm going to play Freeze Mage, Dragon Priest, and I forget exactly what Tice's other decks were, but the idea was, okay, what I'm going to do is beat the aggressive decks. I'm going to target my opponents. I think everyone's going to play, say, Secret Paladin was one of the decks that was targeted heavily there. I'm going to beat my opponent's Secret Paladin deck. I'm going to do so by playing these decks that I think are great against Secret Paladin. Once you expand Conquest to playing more games and requiring more decks, it is both harder to find more decks that can do a particular thing, like beat Secret Paladin, as well as more difficult for those decks to actually achieve their goal. If you need to win 3, say, 70% matchups, it's much easier than winning 4 in terms of your lineup being able to be successful in those specific instances where you're facing what you plan to target. And it makes it much worse in those instances where you have to beat other decks too, because you fall apart in matchups where you aren't running into that. All of that being said, I'd love to see more events experimenting with different types of formats. We kind of have fallen in love with, it seems, at least as a community, or just taken for granted this multi-class, multi-deck format. And I'd love to see, and actually am planning on trying to run some events. For instance, I want to try running an event that has players using a single deck and variations on that deck. People talk about using sideboards, like the concept for Magic, where you have a group of cards that you can swap in and out of your deck. The problem with trying to do that in Hearthstone is the interface doesn't really work with that. You have to go into the collection and change things, and that's all super clunky and awkward. But if, say, you had the ability to have a main deck and then 2 variations on that deck, and that each game you could choose which one of them you want to play, that can reward players for a lot of intelligent deck building and intelligent selection as to what they're going up against in any given game or any given match. So I love seeing stuff like Batstone. I love seeing stuff like the 9-deck Tavern Tales format. Things that can give players reasons to sort of deviate from the sort of core decks that we see in Conquest, and especially in the best of 7 Conquest. I actually am curious to see formats that allow you to have best of X, and this is one of the reasons I like single deck, some variation like the sideboard-ish plan that I was just talking about, because one of the problems with both Last Year Standing and with Conquest is that they become more diluted as you add more games to it. And you want to play, best of 5, then best of 7. I've played in a bunch of events that have had best of 3 for the preliminary rounds, and then get to elimination rounds, and then add another deck. And that has all the sorts of problems of forcing players to prepare decks they're not even necessarily going to use, as well as, sort of causing that additional problem with actually preparing a lineup that changes fundamentally, because it's not just add a deck, it's dilute a strategy once you get to the later rounds. So I'd love to see a format that can avoid that problem, because you want to be able to play, say, best of 5, best of 7, best of 9, to make sort of more skill testing, more dramatic later rounds in tournaments, but forcing people to dilute the strategies and just play everything and not really be able to have a coherent plan just because they have to play so many decks is a failing, in my mind, of those kind of formats as they sort of spread out. You basically just are playing, in many cases, the same decks as everyone else because those are just the solid decks. But if you can have a plan because you can target certain things, I think that gets to be more interesting, and you'll see more diversity inherently. Another thing that I really want to see in Hearthstone that I think would cause more diversity in general is just more cards. This is obviously a pretty tall ask because Hearthstone is on a schedule that I doubt it's going to deviate from. But I think that Hearthstone would really benefit from having more frequent releases. We see, like, for instance, obviously Old Gods and the Shift to Standard had a huge impact on the metagame. Karazhan has cards that have appeared in some decks, but so far we haven't really seen decks that arose from Karazhan. Part of that is there's an incredibly solidified power structure in terms of the decks that already exist. And part of that is there's just not that many cards. Of course you can have individual cards that might actually spur deck types come in adventures, but it's much harder to actually build wholly new strategies when you have a very small pool of cards to choose from. And mostly, I think what you're going to see, and we've kind of seen this borne out, is that without cards like Reno Jackson that are huge dramatic shifts in terms of the way that you actually even approach deck building, it's difficult for smaller sets to have a dramatic impact on the format when they're coming sort of as they are. And I'd love to see at least 2 expansions and just 1 adventure per year. I really hope that we don't see like 2 adventures in 1 expansion, because that just doesn't seem like nearly enough cards. But I'd love to see at least 2 expansions and 2 adventures rather than the 3 sets that we see, because that both increases the total number of cards that players have to play with and make decisions in terms of deck building, but also causes more frequent shifts in the metagame and causes the metagame to become less entrenched and just people get less bored of it. Obviously, that does have downsides for players to have to keep up with all the cards that are being released. But if the difference is 1 adventure per year in total, it doesn't feel like that's that big of an ask in terms of players feeling like they fall behind. An adventure isn't that expensive in dollars, doesn't take that much time to save up for in gold. And I think if we're just ensured that we're having every few months there's a new set coming out, that would really help inject freshness into Hearthstone on a regular basis. So that would help inherently with competitive play, feeling like it gets stale, because it's so strange that it feels like Karazhan just came out and people are just complaining about the fact that the metagame is stale. And some of that is the fact that many of the impacts of Karazhan were just the good decks got better, but some of that too is just we were sitting with the same decks for so long, it felt like, it's been April to effectively September since the metagame has pretty much felt the same. So if that were different, if it were just every 3 months we had some new content coming out, I think that would do a lot to help shake up Hearthstone and make the competitive format feel less stale more often. So there might be something else that I'm missing in terms of thoughts that I have, but I've already rambled on for quite a long time. Definitely more things that I want to share in terms of overall thoughts on Hearthstone and the game in general, but I think that is it for this time. So thank you guys very much for watching. I hope I didn't ramble too long for you to want to actually listen to anything I have to say again, but let me know what you think. Let me know what your thoughts are on Hearthstone as a competitive game. I'll see you next time.